Well, Anthony Albanese has made it clear he's blaming the Sydney floods on climate change. He says this is why he is acting on Australia's emissions target and why the world needs to act. It is the clearest statement on this front from the federal government yet.
What we know is that Australia has always been subject of floods, of bushfires, but we know that the science told us that if we continued to not take action globally on climate change, then these events, extreme weather events, would be more often and more intense. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that play out.
The PM was also on the attack earlier today when it came to Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor suggesting he should have called Premier Dominic Perrottet sooner about the flood situation in New South Wales instead of waiting until he left Ukraine.
People have conflict fatigue and they don't want to see governments arguing. They don't want to see governments acting with the sort of childish comments we've seen from some of my federal counterparts in the last day, criticising, for example, me for not making a phone call when I was in the Ukraine and on radio silence without any electronic equipment. I was fulfilling a responsibility that I believe that I had of travelling to Ukraine. To compare that with a holiday is, I just find, beyond contempt, frankly.
And this is what he was referring to, Angus Taylor, on 2GB Monday afternoon.
It was flooding for 48 hours and he's only just picked up the phone to Dominic Perrottet to ask if he needs a hand. So there's 30,000 people who have been told to evacuate their homes, but the PM's more concerned about his reputation on the global stage.
New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet actually went out of his way this morning to defend the PM over his travel.
I know in some quarters the Prime Minister has been criticised for being away. What I would say is, from my perspective, the federal government needs to balance international concerns and domestic concerns. But as soon as he could, he picked up the phone to call me. I know the engagement between the Murray and Steph, the federal and state emergency service ministers, has been strong from the outset. As I said, Murray is the first emergency service minister from a federal perspective who has come to Homebush, where we stand up SEOC, and that's incredibly important.
The New South Wales Premier also seemed to make it clear that he prefers his relationship with Mr Albanese on some of these issues to that of his relationship with former PM Scott Morrison, even though Perrottet and Morrison are both Liberals. Morrison and Perrottet had several arguments while Perrottet was Treasurer and Premier over what the New South Wales Premier thought was Morrison's tendency to nickel and dime over disaster assistance. In one meeting, Mr Morrison memorably called Mr Perrottet an F-wit. Here was the New South Wales Premier today about how flood grants did not work as well as they should have in the last disaster.
I was disappointed with the pace of the rollout of the grants, particularly at the last event in relation to the Northern Rivers. My expectations were not met by the department. There were challenges in relation to the coordination between the joint state and federal payment systems because the guidelines are set together